My friend Karen has a daughter, Emily. When Emily approached that sometimes challenging age of 13, the two of them sparred regularly, mostly over what Karen, single mom and full-time pastor, was failing to provide or neglecting to do to keep Emily perfectly satisfied. "It is not fair," Emily would complain over and over and over again. After a particularly trying weekend full of negotiating and angry words and grumbling on both sides, Emily demanded that her mom drop everything and drive her across town now, and no, it could not wait until school tomorrow. Having had quite enough, Karen looked her puffed-up daughter straight in the eye and said, "Emily, you are not the sun, and I am not one of your planets." As in this very human family, there is a proper way of ordering things in the world of God's making. We are not the sun, and God is not one of our planets. Prone as we are to posit God as an extension of our wants, our needs, our desires, God refuses to be downsized or domesticated to serve our purposes. God is God, and we are not. Jesus shines a light on the difference between our desires and the desires of God's holy purpose in this morning's parable. He draws a contrast between fairness and generosity, between the notions of merit and the experience of grace. We demand fairness. God gives us grace, and it makes us crazy. The first workers hired to labor in the vineyard are grumbling. At the end of the day, the landowner, here God, in this parable, utilizes a stunning, some would say reckless, pay scale. Those hired at sunrise and at 9 and at noon and at 3, and then those who were hired at 5 and worked only 1 hour received exactly the same wage. The first hires complained bitterly, their adrenaline pumping, their resentment rising, having borne the heat of the day, having endured the scorching sun. They believed that they deserved more than the latecomers. Getting right to the heart of the matter, they raised the question of merit. How is this fair? You have made them equal to us. The landowner, God, invites the first hires to consider the possibilities of grace. My friends, I have dealt fairly with you. I have paid you exactly as I promised. Surely I may do as I wish with my own money. Surely you do not begrudge me my generosity. Actually, we do. We begrudge this extravagance. For the parable exposes us as individuals, as churches, as communities, as nation. We evaluate almost everything through the lens of money. We are earners, tracking our pay stubs, our frequent flyer miles, our rewards at Starbucks. And as earners, we know fair when we see it. Equal pay for equal work? Fair. A reward for going the extra mile or for our loyalty? Fair. Merit pay for extraordinary effort and productivity? Fair. But notice what goes missing in the quid pro quo of money and merit. Grace never enters the calculations. Church reformer John Wesley says that we should not be surprised because there are few matters, he wrote, more repugnant to reasonable people than the grace of God. We want fairness. God gives grace, and it makes us crazy. The last hireds, unchosen in the world of merit, discover something different in the landowner, a generous presence, a fountain of mercy, an occasion for joy. It seems to make all the difference where you stand in this parable. In Santa Biblia, Justo Gonzalez describes the applause that breaks out in Latino communities as the landowner gives the last hireds a full day's pay. Jean-Pierre Ruiz sees in the parable the circumstance of immigrant day laborers across the United States. To ask them, "Why are you idle?" is not to ask a benign question. Esteban, a 26-year-old indigenous farmer from Chiapas, speaks of the harshness of the daily search for work. Sometimes you don't go because you weren't chosen. You feel crushed. Those waiting on street corners to be chosen or at strip malls, those traveling in pickups from field to field seeking work, those on the margins of the workforce, vulnerable and exploitable, for whom "give us this day our daily bread" is a plea for the mercy of God. These God chooses to receive extravagant grace. God has a sense of humor, for God seems to enjoy upending our well-ordered meritocracies. And for those waiting to be chosen, God's grace becomes life and hope. We live in a time where meanness has taken hold of us. Envy and jealousy blind us to the goodness of God's grace. Always trying to determine who is getting away with something, when truth be told, we all get away with something. It shrinks the heart. It produces bitter enmity. When what matters is money alone and getting what we deserve and too bad for everybody else, the wells of compassion and kindness dry up. My brothers and my sisters, we can labor all day long in the vineyard and miss the blessing. Oblivious to the mercy of God, resentful of the grace of God. Facing the truth about ourselves in the deepest places, we know that what we most desperately need, we do not merit and we cannot earn. More than anything else in all the world, we need God to be God. We need thoughts higher than our thoughts. Prayer better than our prayer, power beyond our power, that we may spend and be spent as glad and generous workers in the vineyards of God's love and light. Every morning when Russell Moon arrived in his office at the church, he lit a candle. The candle sat in a very visible place on the corner of his desk. And everyone knew if that candle was lit, Russell was somewhere on the church property. For over 40 years, Russell served United Methodist churches in small towns, in rural farming communities, and in the ranch lands of South Texas. Now, people may not think of places like Edna, Texas, as having faced the same challenges as the Deep South during the times of civil rights. And yet they did, and they faced it on two fronts: the struggle of African Americans and the struggle of the first generation of Mexican immigrants. Russell served with unfailing grace and courage during the rough days of that journey. In the period of time covered by the movement, almost 30 United Methodist clergy were ordained in that part of Texas. Beaten up and broken down by the viciousness of the struggle, one by one they began to fall away. They left parish ministry until only 4 were left. Russell was one of the 4. Whatever happened to him in those years made him wise. It made him deep. It made him a person of prayer, and I never once heard him complain. All I ever heard him say was, by the grace of God, I was faithful. By the mercy of God, I survived. Russell bore the burden of the day. He endured the scorching heat, and at day's end, he never received a big steeple church. He never held a prominent position. He never earned a big salary. Younger clergy, including myself, surpassed him in money, prestige, and power, if those measure anything at all. But none of us surpassed him in sheer goodness and grace. Russell was one of those people that you would drive 3 hours across the hot, flat Texas coastal plain to see and take him to lunch at the local diner. Because Russell would be a balm for your soul and a kick in your pants all at the same time. He was prayer and prophecy, steely and soft, resident scholar and disciple following Jesus on the road, all rolled into one. And he loved the people of God more generously and less jealously than anyone I have ever known. I asked him once about that candle. Well, dear, he said, I light this candle to remind myself, I am not the light. I follow the light, and that makes a big difference. Jesus calls me to follow him and live in such a way that others may catch a glimpse in me of the grace of God. And if you do that every day, every day, every day, that candle shining in this office can have an effect on this church. And if on this church, then on this town. And soon people get caught up in the grace of the heart of God, and they don't even realize it's happening. God is God, and we are not. And yet, we bear God's likeness. We are made in God's image, and it can grow in us as surely as it grew in Russell, as surely as it grows in all the little ones that God chooses. Thanks be to God. Amen.